tonight's International Dermatology Foundation Educational Series webinar. My name is Ashley with RBC Consultants, and the title of tonight's program is Expert Consensus on Advanced Topical Nonsteroidal Therapies for Chronic Hand Eczema. As our moderator this evening, we have Dr. Leon Kircik. He's the medical director of the IDF, clinical professor of dermatology at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, New York, and also adjunct clinical professor of dermatology, Indiana University School of Medicine in Indianapolis, Indiana, and also medical director of physician skincare, derm research, and skin sciences, all out of Louisville, Kentucky. As our speaker this evening, we have Dr. April Armstrong. She's professor and chief for the Division of Dermatology at the University of California, Los Angeles. She's from Los Angeles, California. We would like to thank our supporter, Leo, for making this educational event possible. Before we begin, we have a few logistic tips. If you're having any issues hearing this webinar, you can listen to the presentation using your telephone. Select Settings and then Phone Call in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. If you're having any technical issues, please submit your questions in the question pane. You'll find that at the top right-hand side of your screen. At the end of the webinar, a survey is going to pop up in your browser, and this same survey will also be emailed to you within 1 to 2 days. We would greatly appreciate it if you could fill out this survey. Also within 1 to 2 days of the webinar, a certificate of attendance will be emailed to you. At the end of our program, we will have a Q&A, and you're welcome to submit your questions using the question pane on the top right-hand side of your screen. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass the floor virtually to Dr. Kircik.
Thank you, Ashley, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us to another series of IDF webinars. Before I go and introducing to our speaker tonight, I'd like to tell you a little bit about IDF's principal mission. It is to raise awareness and improve dermatology care all over the world, especially in underserved areas through education. And since the pandemic, we've been broadcasting over not only in US, but also in Canada, South America, Europe, Southeast Asia, as well as Australia. And here you can see some of our previous programs. Please stay up to date with us at Instagram, Facebook, as well as LinkedIn. But also you can visit us at idfeducationalseries.com. Tonight we have a very special program, and we have a very special guest. Dr. April Armstrong, a good friend of mine. She is the professor and chief of division of dermatology at UCLA. She's going to tell us about advanced non-topical non-steroidal therapies for chronic hand eczema. And this program is basically the output of a couple of months ago. Some of us got together, some experts, and we actually came up with a recent publication at JDD on this topic. And this is going to be sort of the summary of that publication. So April, thank you so much for joining us. And April was the first author of that publication at JDD. So she's going to summarize and make this webinar a very, very pleasant experience because we're going to learn a lot. I'm looking forward to it, April.
Great. Thank you very much, Leon, for that introduction. And I am so happy to be here and talking to everyone here. And I know that we are also going to make this an interactive session because Dr. Kircik has so much wealth of knowledge to share in this area as well. So I think we'll have a nice dialogue as we go along with our presentation. And here is, let me just advance the slide. There we go. Great. So when we're thinking about chronic hand eczema and we're thinking about the nonsteroidal therapies for this area, I think is an area that has seen a lot of growth. And today we're going to talk first about some of the clinical classifications and presentations of CHE, and that will probably be hopefully somewhat of a review for some of you. And I'm going to talk about the classification of CHE, and importantly, there has been older classification, but also newer classification as well. But I'm going to focus on the newer classification, that's etiology-based classification. And then we're going to dive into really the meat of the talk, which is this results of the expert consensus statements that was just published in JDD that talks about the use of nonsteroidal agents for chronic hand eczema. So when we're thinking about chronic hand eczema, one of the first things is definition. How do you define hand eczema as chronic, for example, versus acute? And I think the field has converged onto the definition that for chronic hand eczema, it's defined as persistence of hand eczema for more than 3 months. Or if you've had this condition recurring 2 times or more within a 12-month period. So you can fulfill either of those conditions, and then you could be considered having chronic hand eczema. And this definition is mostly based on the European Society of Guidelines on contact dermatitis. So again, chronic hand eczema, think about in terms of both the duration as well as frequency. So more than 3 months persistence or recurring twice or more within a 12-month period. And when we're thinking about the classification of hand eczema, that has evolved over time. For a very long time, we had this mix of etiology and morphology type of classification. But as of late, most of the field is really converging on thinking about hand eczema, classification hand eczema, more towards etiological. So you may hear some terms when people describe hand eczema as more etiologically based definition, and other terms that are more morphologically focused. I think they serve different purposes. I'm going to present today the etiological classification, which is a little bit newer of a classification derived from this mix of classification in the past. So first etiological subtype that I'm going to talk about is irritant contact dermatitis. And when we're thinking about chronic hand eczema, certainly this is something we see very frequently. And I would say this is the most frequent form when we're thinking about epidemiology of CHE. Oftentimes, when we're looking at the patient's hands, you'll see oftentimes the extensor surfaces and lateral surfaces that are involved. I know in my clinical practice, I look very carefully at the web spaces, and that's oftentimes a clue as to irritant contact dermatitis. And I often, when I see that, I would ask my patients, how often do you wash your hands? And they may not think their hand washing is that frequent, but it is important for me to understand whenever I'm suspecting irritant contact dermatitis. Oftentimes, hand washing can be a part of the story, but there are other etiologies for this as well. So here are some additional examples. If you look at the left-hand one, no pun intended, you will see the web space that's involved on the left-hand side. So I really look at the web spaces because the liquid oftentimes can get into those web spaces, the chronic use of soap, oftentimes that can irritate that area. So the web spaces, to me, is oftentimes a good clue for that. And let's continue to take a look at some additional findings here. So when we're thinking about these etiological subtype, here's another picture showing a patient with skin of color here. So as you can see, hyperpigmentation. And on the right-hand side is a rather dramatic presentation of someone who had used 5-FU chronically. And then as you can see, that really an extreme case of irritant contact dermatitis. And I want to go to Dr. Kircik and then see, Leon, what do you think about this? How do you approach these patients, and any pearls that you want to share with our audience about that?
So, I feel very comfortable taking care of the patient with skin of color because 35 to 40% of my patient population is skin of color. So I think to your point, especially with the excessive hand washing and the soap, I think the soap itself is a big problem because, as you know, regular soap basic, it's pH basic, it's almost 9 to 10, and that is quite irritating to the epidermal barrier. So one thing I try to emphasize, I'm always use soaps that are pH of 4.5 to 5, mostly acidic pH. And of course, those things usually don't sud. And people think that if the soap doesn't sud and it doesn't foam, they are not clean. So I try, and that's a really bad perception, but we all have it. Even sometimes I think, oh my God, if it doesn't sud, I'm not cleaning myself. But so that's one thing that we have to do, patient education, and really teach them that be careful the cleansers that you're using as long as it doesn't sud. Now, the other one, the 5FU one, is really tough. I wouldn't know what to do. I would be using some barrier cream there first before I irritate. I think because any topical there, it's going to irritate the hell out of that hand. I would like probably to give some time to heal and to use some barrier cream there.
I think those are great tips in terms of the pH balance, use of soap, for example. And I totally hear you about if they see something, we see something that doesn't sud, we think it's not doing the job. So kind of changing the mentality around that. And I know there are over-the-counter now cleansers that are more gentle, that don't sud, and I think that's something to be aware of. I think the picture on the right hand side is probably someone who's using 5FU for AKs on the back of the hand, which is a good reminder for us, you know, if we are recommending that, making sure to have restrictions on the duration and communicating that carefully to our patients. Yeah, great. We'll continue on, and then we're going to take a look at the next etiologic subtype, and that's allergic contact dermatitis. So when we think about this particular this type of chronic hand eczema, I think timing is really important. Typically, after a patient is exposed to the allergen, usually this starts to get worse about 24 to 72 hours after the exposure. And when this was studied, they noticed that this is mostly type 4, so delayed hypersensitivity. And things that are typical triggers can include rubber accelerators, metals, preservatives, fragrances. And I think this is where patch testing can be quite useful in those patients. So when I think about this, you know, for pearls for this is that when we were looking at the palmar plantar area, you have the barrier, a disruption plus a friction there. You can get delayed healing. And also looking at the tips and the palms, areas of frequent allergen exposure, they tend to be more affected. And then also the tips, fingertips and periungual skin often points to this more acrylic or hair cosmetic allergens. And and in patients that we suspect that might be the case, and we can talk about some of the occupational categories later on that we may consider patch testing. Any thoughts on this, Leon?
You know, here is my dilemma is always to test or not to test. And I do extensive patch testing in my office. And, you know, sometimes you don't get any yield out of the patch test, or even sometimes you get a positive patch test. It's almost impossible to stop what they're allergic to. These people work every day. They have a life. How can you say, oh, don't touch nickel? You hold the money every day, it's nickel, right? Or some people are chefs and they cook, they clean. You know, imagine a housewife, a mother change diapers and do the dishes. How are you gonna handle it? How are you gonna avoid the allergens? So I do like to patch test to know what's happening, but on the other hand, sometimes we cannot get, and we don't have all the treatment options, or the, I should say, the answers actually what to do with the result of the patch test, which becomes a dilemma.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Also, I think you mentioned also earlier the relevance, right? The relevance of the patch testing, because sometimes it may be positive, but may not be quite relevant in terms of contributing to the disease presentation. So making sure that, you know, you're connected with someone who's experienced at patch testing and also can explain the results to the patients is very important.
Yeah.
I thought that I also take this opportunity to kind of show people this particular chart, which looks at a number of at-risk groups, for example, healthcare workers, what are some of the typical exposures they would be exposed to, and then specifically, what are some of the common allergens and any clinical clues. This is here mainly as a reference. I oftentimes ask them in terms of an occupation that will give me an idea whether they potentially belong in these different occupational groups which have increased risk of developing chronic hand eczema, and especially this particular allergic type. And if you look at this, for example, you see certain occupations in addition to healthcare workers, hairdressers, and cleaners, and food handlers, construction workers, and so on. So I think those are important occupation to highlight, and this particular table is helpful and useful for us to think about common allergens in that particular patient population. And just kind of to hone in on this a little bit more, this is an example of a hairdresser, and I wanted to show this example because it showed significant fingertip involvement and periungual skin, which we talked about before. And this is oftentimes hairdressers are exposed to PPD, so paraphenyldiamine or fragrances or preservatives, and that can really you see that as a common form of allergic contact form of CHE within this within this occupation. Okay, with that, we're going to go to the next and our last subtype here, etiological subtype, and this is atopic hand eczema. And usually when we're looking at this, usually younger in terms of age of onset, have concurrent or history of atopic dermatitis. We oftentimes in the hand area may not see as many vessels, and you see that oftentimes involvement of dorsum of the hands. So there are some overlap in terms of clinical presentation. You can also see interdigital spaces, for example. And I'll show you a few more examples of this, as you can see other examples of atopic hand eczema. And I would say sometimes it's a little bit of diagnosis of exclusion after you've excluded irritant causes that contribute to this, or potentially allergic causes, but definitely something to kind of be watch out for. And I would say, so those three are the most common type. I want to actually give you one last type, which is a less common. This is the protein contact dermatitis or contact urticaria. So this is different from some of the prior types in that this is actually type 1 or immediate type hypersensitivity reaction. And oftentimes it's interesting, it's this IgE mediated reaction to animal proteins that in certain foods, for example, or latex. And this is where patients have minutes within the contact. You see the urticaria, you see the edema, you see the vesiculation. And from repeated exposure, then the presentation can evolve from this urticarial presentation to a more eczematous presentation. Sometimes skin prick test or specific IgE tests can be something that one can consider. Oftentimes patch testing is negative in these patients. And I just wanted to also give you some additional context with regards to this. So this is an example of immediate stinging, and you can see the erythema and edema, for example, in this particular patient who have this, the last type are protein contact dermatitis. And then here is the story of two confectionery workers. As you can see, they actually both had had protein contact dermatitis, CHE, to eggs. So you can't, like to Leon's earlier point, in some professions you may not be able to avoid using that. So I thought this is an interesting presentation in terms of someone who work in the confectionery business and presenting with this last type. So one take-home message to note is that when we're looking at these different etiological subtypes, 3 a bit more common, last one, protein contact, a bit less common. is that regardless of which type, oftentimes what we are seeing is that even though irritant may be more of a Th1, Th17 presentation, the atopic hand eczema is a bit more of a Th2, Th22 profile. And then finally, when you have allergic contact, you can have a mixed presentation in terms of the different cytokines and immune profiles. But the important part is that most of these pathways are all mediated through the JAK-STAT pathway. And that is why oftentimes when we are targeting JAK-STAT pathway as a therapeutic target for CHE, that can be quite helpful. I'm going to pause, see if Leon have any thoughts on this or some of the earlier subtypes.
So just thinking, I was thinking about the protein contact allergy, right? And I was thinking if the butchers would get the most. And then right after that, you show the picture with the confectionery workers, which I wasn't thinking of. But I wonder if the butchers would be the first candidate, right? Touching the meat all the time, cutting and packing, whatever. So I was thinking of that. But I really think this is a very important concept, what this slide here, what you're showing, right? Because we are so, I shouldn't say convinced, but we're so like used to the concept of targeted treatment, right? The biologics targeting psoriasis, IL-17, IL-23, and even with atopic derm, IL-13, IL-4, but it's very, and the IL-31. So here, this is a really, really a heterogeneous disease. And you have psoriasis pathway involved, Th17, we have AD pathway involved, Th2, Th22, even we have Th1 pathway involved, right? And ironically, when I started long time ago, I always biopsied. Every single time comes back psoriasis from dermatitis. I cannot remember a single time that I get an answer. It's either psoriasis or it's dermatitis. So, and this is the proof why we're not getting that biopsy answer that we're looking for always. Which one is it? Because it's both. And here you can see this slide that really tells us that, you know, targeting treatment here, it's not going to work unless you're dealing with the atopic and eczema, right? Because we know that tralokinumab at the head-hand study, I was part of that it worked very well for people who are atopic and also have hand eczema. But in this case, when they are just chronic hand eczema and you don't know which type it is and they don't have anything else anywhere on the body, so this is the JAK pathway is the best because you're basically targeting everything, in all honesty. So this is one time you don't need targeted treatment.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think those are really great points, and I agree. Sometimes, but oftentimes, actually, biopsying the hand uh, can be a little bit tricky, and the likelihood of the biopsying yielding a definitive answer or discriminating answer can be a little bit low. So on
Yeah.
a few occasions, I do try to temper my patients' expectations. Sometimes they really want a biopsy,
Yeah.
and I say, well, we could do it. So, but I think mainly this is, to be honest, like more of a clinical diagnosis where we need to be careful about finding clinical clues. But the good news is that the JAK-STAT pathway is the underlying common pathway by which all these different types mediate. Great. And so, and then now with that as a background, and we are going to look at the expert consensus that we did. And there we go. Oh, let me go back to just a few. Oh, there we go. So when we're looking at the state of the science here, a number of us who are all listed here, and Dr. Kircik, you're part of this, we thought there's a need for an understanding of the use of advanced topical nonsteroidal therapies for chronic hand eczema. And the reason for this is that for a very long time, when we're thinking about hand eczema, we really didn't have anything that's FDA approved. And also, in addition to that, while steroidals have had their place in terms of treatment of patients with CHE, we do have newer innovations in this particular area, and we felt that our field likely would benefit from this particular article. So we're going to This has been published in March 2026. And at the time when we review the evidence, I shall say that here are the different non-steroidal topicals that we looked at for chronic hand eczema. And of those, as you can see here, we have the FDA approved as well as off-label use of non-steroidal agents that have been used, I would say, in clinical practice for our patients with CHE. So we looked at the data behind all of these different agents. And the method that we use is that we did the structured literature review followed by the Delphi rounds, where the 7 dermatologists with expertise in inflammatory dermatoses gathered to do this. And also our recommendation strength was graded using SORT methods. So we came up, there are 7 consensus statements, so we're going to go over them one by one. And so the first statement is regarding how we have delgocitinib is currently the only approved topical treatment for chronic hand eczema, an appropriate first-line advanced therapy. And in coming up with this statement, we looked at how delgocitinib improves the key signs and symptoms of CHE, and it provides a steroid-sparing alternative. And I think those are really important. We also looked at other non-steroidals, so those as well as systemic agents. And what we see is that, for example, ruxolitinib, tapinarof, roflumilast, crisaborole, and then the systemic therapies, dupilumab and tralokinumab, have some literature with regards to their use in CHE, whether it's off-label use or earlier phase studies. And then most of those are sometimes geared toward one specific type of CHE, not the other. But we review that literature as well. So for those of you who are starting to gain experience with delgocitinib, this is more as a kind of refresher, as a reminder. So the delgocitinib cream is applied as 20 milligrams per gram, and it's applied as a thin layer twice a day. And the recommended ideal use is approximately 12 hours apart, but it doesn't have to be exactly that, to the affected areas of the hands and wrist only. And the maximum is 30 grams per 2 weeks or 60 grams per month of use. And if your patient's thinking about putting on emollients, it's important to let them know that emollients should not be applied within 2 hours before or after the delgocitinib application. So, and I think this is to allow for the best absorption, ideal state absorption of delgocitinib. I'm going to pause here and ask Leon, what did you think about the first statement and its efficacy?
Well, I think I have a feeling you're gonna show the efficacy, but in
Yeah.
clinical practice as well, not only in the clinical studies, but we do have really, really good efficacy with this drug. And honestly, it's the only drug that's approved for CHE, right? And we sort of can ride it. And it's sort of getting easier, I think, to get the third-party payers to approve it because it only makes sense. It's the only drug that's approved for this purpose.
Mhm.
So sometimes they do want the first steroid use, but I think it's getting sort of easier and easier to get the approvals and the prior authorization business.
I agree. Yes, yeah. I think the take-home message here is that we now very excitingly have FDA-approved therapy, and this is the first FDA-approved therapy specifically for chronic hand eczema, and it's regardless of the subtype that your patients may be experiencing. And it's a pretty fairly straightforward application, twice a day, thin film on the affected areas. Okay, so let's take a look at another topic, which is the speed of onset, and also looking at, related to that, looking at some of the improvements in terms of signs and symptoms of CHE with our therapies. So this is our statement number 2. Advanced topical nonsteroidal therapies provide rapid and sustained improvement in the signs and symptoms of chronic hand eczema, including skin pain and pruritus. And in terms of formulating this particular statement, we've had a number of different discussion points, and those included when we're looking at the FDA approved option, we have data for delgocitinib, probably has the strongest CHE specific evidence in this area. We have clinical data showing both visible signs and symptoms, and also importantly, symptom relief as early as week 4. And then when we're thinking about this and thinking about the other types of nonsteroidals, sometimes when they're used off-label, they can be very helpful too for some of the select patients. But when we're looking at the data specifically, and I'll show you some of the data later on from the Delta studies, I can show you the rapidity as well as sustainability of the effect. And then before I go there, to see if Leon, if you have any comments on this.
I remember, April, when we were voting on those, how we discussed that, how important it is the pain and the pruritus, not only the signs, but the symptoms of the disease, and how much these patients really suffer, both from the itching as well as the discomfort, pain of the skin. But the other thing I remember that we discussed, the IgA that was used in the study was much more stringent when it came to the erythema part, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I wasn't involved with those studies, but we discussed that, and it was quite interesting how stringent it was, the IgA calculation here, the table.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, absolutely. So with that, let's take a look at some of the clinical trial cases here. And I'm going to show you a picture of a patient here with chronic hand eczema. So this is a baseline of a patient. So the IgA score of 3, Hexi of 99, high Hexi score, that's a hand eczema severity score. And then we have DLQI of 12, which is very high impact on the quality of life. Significant itch, nearly 7, and then the pain score of 6.5 at baseline. And this person has tried emollients and intermittent topical corticosteroids, but found that to be inadequately controlled. And here's the same person. We're looking at the same hand, and on the right-hand side, you see the same hand about 16 weeks later. So as you can see here, significant improvement going from moderate to almost clear score on the IgA score, and also significant improvement, I would say, in terms of the quality of life here, going to a 1, which, as we know, 0 or 1 on DLQI means that the skin disease, have almost no impact on someone's quality of life. And very importantly, let's take a look at the itch score. So Hess itch of 2, there's still some slight itching left, but overall significantly improved, and also pain score is significantly improved as well. So that's one example of a patient. But if we look at the Delta data here, what we see is that the Delta 1 and 2 treatment success. So on the left-hand side, we see the delgocitinib cream versus the vehicle cream. As you can see, significant difference between the two. And then on the right-hand side is looking specifically at the long-term efficacy. And what we see is that overall very good maintenance of results. And now, if you went to the AAD, you probably saw this a presentation of looking at delgocitinib and asking the question, does prior systemic exposure matter? Does it matter if a patient has had prior systemic therapy for their chronic hand eczema? And what was found is that what you see here are 2 lines, right? For each category has two lines on this forest plot. The top line represents those who have not had systemic therapy for their CHE, and the bottom is people who have experienced. Now, if you think that patients with more experienced disease are harder to treat, what we see here is that in most cases, if it's measured by how the hand looks, by the IgA and Hexi score, it actually, as you can see, not much difference between patients who are systemic naive versus experienced. When we look at the itch and pain score, it does seem that patients who are systemic experienced probably have a little bit wider variety in terms of variation, in terms of a response. But I would say overall, what I see here is that regardless of prior systemic exposure, that we see good response to delgocitinib, regardless of their systemic exposure. And we'll continue on to the next one. Here is a different medication. Here is ruxolitinib. What we see here is that we have phase 2 study results with ruxolitinib. And on the left-hand side, we see changing itch over time. And on the that's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is a change in terms of itch by the CHE subtype. So having kind of reviewed that, I wanted to see if, Leon, you have any thoughts on the systemic naive versus experienced, or any thoughts on the use of Rux for CHE?
Yeah, so first let's go back to the systemic versus naive experience versus naive. I think the drug works equally well on everyone at the end of the day. So and then Rux, I think I used to use Rux quite a bit before really Delgo came to the market at the approval. And I think it's much easier to get the third-party payers to get approved for Delgo because of the indication than the off-label use, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yes,
fortunately, I should say.
I hear you. Yes. Okay, so let's see here. We're going to continue on to talking about sleep. And I would say sleep is one of those things that definitely contribute to our overall quality of life. I don't know, Leon, did you have a good sleep last night?
I actually, believe it or not, did not.
You actually did not. Okay.
I did not. Not because I
Okay.
have CHE.
Yeah, I think, I think for all of us, the quality of sleep can oftentimes dictate, our mood, how we feel. And what we looked at is not only sleep, but other aspects of quality of life in patients with CHE, and how they may be affected by that, and what our therapies can do for them. And so our next statement, which is statement 3, talks about the advanced topical nonsteroidal therapies can improve this quality of life in our patients with chronic CHE. Okay, so when we're looking at specifically the literature in this area, I want to highlight a few things here. Is that we not only, as a field, when we're looking at the delgocitinib data, collected signs and symptoms, but also, very importantly, improvement in quality of life. And they saw a significant difference between those who are put on the active treatment versus the vehicle. And in addition to improvement in overall quality of life, they also see specifically the skin pain is something that's really stood out in terms of significant improvement there. And also in the Delta 4 study, which we'll go over a little bit as one of our main statement later on, where it's compared to an oral therapy, the oral alitretinoin, they saw that patients on the topical therapy twice a day had actually demonstrated much greater health-related quality of life improvement than the oral tretinoin. So oral alitretinoins, which I thought was very interesting. So comparing a twice daily topical application with the oral medication. But we'll go over that study in a little bit more detail when we get to the head-to-head part. So here are some of the latest data. So this is kind of fresh off from the AAD. And what we see here is really looking at the sustainability of health-related quality of life. On the very top, you see mean DLQI score. If you remember, the baseline score is 12.6, right? So the quality of life really sucked for our patients. And then when we look progressively over time, what you see is that significant improvement. So around about 4.5 around week 16, and you see overall maintenance of that degree of improvement over time. And I would say, when I was looking at this and looking at what were some of the key areas that were improved when we look at the subdomains, what you see is that daily activity was something that was really noted by our patients. And I would say it's probably because we use our hands all the time. So it's not just a symptom only improvement, but rather the function for our hands have improved as well. And also, as you can see here, personal relationship, right? When we think about shaking hands and how that feels, significant difference between Delgo treated arms versus significant improvement, I shall say, from baseline to later week 16 and then week 52. I'm going to pause and see, Leon, any thoughts on this data?
No, it's always amazing to look at this DLQI data. And unfortunately, we don't pay much attention to DLQI in this country. But as you know, in EU, it's actually one of the approval conditions, right? In addition to IGA and EASI 75 or PASI 75 in psoriasis or in atopic derm. So it's pretty amazing. And I think it's so important. And as you mentioned, especially when it comes to hands, I think it's much more important than any other disease entity because this is not only emotionally, sometimes we talk about when we talked about alopecia areata or vitiligo, we talked about the emotional improvement, but in this case, it has a lot to do with physical improvement when it comes to, as you said, handshaking, using your laptop, doing housework, doing dishes, changing diapers at school, doing homework. So it's amazing how how effective and how impactful it is in our patient's life.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let's take a look at the next statement. And when we're thinking about the next statement, I would say that we are thinking about work. So workplaces, I think those two are co-workers. This is a stock image, but as you can see, they're collaborating, they're clapping hands. I think when we looked at this, we wanted to, as a consensus group, really talk about work-related disability, which is something that we oftentimes actually don't talk about much, but is a domain that's quite relevant when we're thinking about chronic hand eczema. So here, when we have this statement number 4, I'll read it to you, is that advanced topical nonsteroidal therapies for chronic hand eczema improve productivity in activities of daily living and decrease work-related disability. And I think why that's important is that not only do we think about improvement in terms of your work productivity from an individual kind of career advancement perspective, but also the decrease in work-related disability is intimately related to that, and it can affect also macroeconomics. And then, when we're thinking about employees and companies, and when they're thinking about addressing these different aspects and then really improve workers' quality of life, I think, especially for CHE, those issues are really central. So what were some of the specific topics we discussed under that where we have data? Well, I'm going to show you some of the data in the next slide, but overall what we saw is that delgocitinib actually improved work productivity as well as the daily activities in patients with CHE. And we also saw, probably not surprisingly, I would say, improvement that's in a patient's quality of life correlates with the reduction in their limitations, in their functional limitations. And then also early pain and itch relief can help restore hand function as early as week 1. So the cream can work fast and as early as week 1 with a significant reduction in itch and pain that can help restore hand function. Okay, so I know you're all very much waiting for this. So this is looking at phase 3 open label extension of the Delta 3 trial. And so this is the open label extension period for delgocitinib. And we're looking here at a few different elements here. So we're looking on the left-hand side, you see panel A is the total work productivity loss. So a decrease in that, meaning a decrease in the productivity loss. Then we look very specifically at absenteeism, right? So absenteeism, so by the way, this is the open label extension period. So this is after patients has been treated, they roll into the open label extension period. We want to see if they can maintain, for example, that good response over time. And what we see is that overall a reduction in terms of absenteeism overall, and also you can see that on the right-hand side, you have presenteeism, right? Absenteeism is you just can't show up to work, you're absent. And presenteeism is where you're at work, but you are not you cannot pay closer attention because of the chronic hand eczema disabilities. And then you can see here significant reduction in the presenteeism with a longer duration of treatment. And then the last panel, panel D, which is in the right lower hand corner, is really measuring the daily activity impairment here. I'm going to pause to see if Leon have any thoughts on this.
So I really think this is a very, very important slide. And to me, the most important part, the difference here, absenteeism and presenteeism, right? When you look at absenteeism, it's about, at the baseline, it's about 30, the mean. When you look at the presenteeism, it's almost 63. It's double, more than the double. And this is a real issue with almost all dermatologic conditions, because patients are not sick enough to call sick and not to go to work because they don't want to lose their wages. But they go and they're, I should say, very unproductive and very inefficient, especially washing their skin or put moisturizer, putting creams and this and that, wrapping their hands if it's bleeding. And this is a real issue for most of the employers. You know, I live in Louisville, and the UPS center is here. And I talked quite a bit with the UPS people, and they told me that presenteeism is the biggest problem with dermatologic diseases. It's very interesting, and I didn't know that. But it's so obvious here. What they are telling is so correct, and it's so amazing. And therefore, all these employers actually, when they manage their payers, they actually pay attention to this, ironically. So not the PBMs, not the insurance companies, but if the big entities such as UPS or whoever, if they manage their healthcare, they actually pay attention and they try to fix it.
I think those are such important points, and especially I would say kind of UPS delivery workers, right? Mail handling workers, lots of hand use that imagine if you can use your hands effectively or well, that's a significant decrease in terms of your work productivity. Absolutely. Okay, we're going to go to the next topic area that we discussed, and that has to do with the head-to-head trials. I'm just waiting for this to advance here. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, there we go. So there we go. I just wanted to show this nice image. So of the head-to-head trials, now we know there actually, first of all, there are very few chronic hand eczema dedicated trials to begin with. And so to have a head-to-head study, I think is really informative for our field. That's why I think, Leon, when we were sitting together and talking about this, we were all very excited about this head-to-head trial. And we're going to review the results imminently. And essentially, after we review the results, the statement here is number 5. As you can see, among approved therapies, dalgocitinib demonstrates superior efficacy and tolerability compared to oral alitretinoin in chronic hand eczema. So this is exciting because the two has been compared in a head-to-head fashion. And what we will show you is that significant improvement in terms of superiority, not only significant improvement, but superiority of dalgocitinib compared to alitretinoin. And that was seen, clinical improvement was seen by week 12, but then maintained also by week 24. And we also saw benefits in terms of the patient-reported outcomes. And very importantly, more favorable tolerability profile compared to the oral alitretinoin. So here is the result of this. I'm going to pause here. And as you can see here, so the blue line, which is shows the greater decrease change, right, in a HEXI score, which measures chronic hand eczema, compared to the top blue line, the oral alitretinoin line in terms of the response. So what do you think about this, Leon?
So, you know, I was amazed with this result. I think I told you we talked about it. First of all, most of us in US are not familiar with alitretinoin, but I was privileged actually to be involved with the studies years ago. I don't know how many years ago, more than 10, maybe 15 years ago. It was a company from Switzerland called Basilia that they came to us. We did the study. I had more than 21, 22 people in that study. It's a very, very powerful oral retinoid. It works really well. It's approved in Europe as well as in Canada, I believe, but not in the US. So it's a very, very powerful drug. And honestly, I told the sponsors at the time that it's crazy for a cream to go against the oral retinoid. And I said, it's even crazier, at least if you're gonna do it a non-inferiority trial rather than a superiority trial. You know, both of us are very much involved in clinical trial business. It's like really crazy to go against for the cream to go against the oral medication, systemic medication, especially superiority. And they accomplished it. They were superior. Delgo is superior to alitretinoin. It's amazing. It tells you about this topical JAK inhibitor, how powerful it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I was a little nervous, because we don't see head-to-head studies very much of
No,
topical against oral. And to not only uh, do this and then to show superiority, I think that was a very, very sort of a seminal work.
gutsy
And
move. Gutsy move.
yes, absolutely. Very gutsy. Okay, so now let's talk about safety as the next topic area. And we review the results, and the consensus statement is that the topical nonsteroidals for CHE are safe, well tolerated, and do not require a laboratory workup. So I know we had a few discussions around that. And so let's take a look at this one. And then, so what we see here is that we talked about a few different things, and we know that some of our topical therapies have labeling language that we felt wasn't quite warranted. I shall point that out directly in clinical practice because they were borrowed from systemic JAK inhibitors that are treating a different disease and are taken orally. And when we look at some of the minimal state sort of absorption studies, maximum absorption studies for the topical, we've seen really good data for our nonsteroidals. So that is why we as a group thought the current nonsteroidal therapies, when it's used as directed, do not require laboratory workup and overall are very well tolerated. So any thoughts on this, Leon?
I have to say, I was very proud and happy with the FDA decision that finally they saw the light at the end of the tunnel that, this topical medication, topical JAK inhibitor does not need a box warning. And I thought it was quite unwarranted. I have to name it, right? The topical rocks got the box warning when oral rocks does not have a box warning. That I thought that is really, really unreasonable, but it is what it is. We cannot always look for reasoning on the agency's behavior or decisions. But I was very, very happy that at least topical Dalgo does not have a box warning. And of course, it's great news that we don't have to do any lab monitoring or any screening tests or anything else.
Mhm.
That's very reassuring.
Yes, yeah, I think that's really reassuring as well. And I think that as a field, also, as we're thinking about these topical JAK inhibitors, we are really coming to understand their safety a lot more than the days when we didn't have any topical JAK inhibitor
Yeah.
therapies. So I think that's a positive sign to have to beginning to have label language that reflects the medication that's actually tested and then in the population that's intended to be tested.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, that was I have a summary slide prior to this, and we'll see. So essentially that was the six. There we go. Those are the six different statements here. As you can see, we looked at all of them. All of them had the strength recommendation level of A based on large pivotal studies that studied those specific outcomes, with the exception of statement 4, where in terms of the work productivity, we had those secondary analysis, some of the analysis that are there, but weren't sort of, those weren't the primary endpoints. That's why it was strength level C. But I think is really helpful to have that data, to have that outcome discussed and evaluated. Okay, so with that, I want to thank everyone, and I'm going to hand over the microphone to Leon virtually.
Thank you. Thank you so much, April. As usual, you did such a wonderful job. It was very, very eye-opening. And every time I listen to you, I learn something more. So this was a really great program in the sense that we went over this paper that was published, and it was a great summary of that paper. And so it was great. I don't think we're going to have any time. It's almost 7:58 for any questions. But I think we did have an interactive session anyway. We discussed a lot of those. So now that we are done with this webinar, I'd like to thank our supporter, Leo, for supporting this whole webinar. And thank you so much for really educating us on chronic hand eczema and new treatment option. And our next program is on June the 9th, Tuesday at 7 p.m. with Dr. Ben Est, and he is going to tell us all about the signs of VTAMA, another non-steroidal topical. So I thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone. Good night.